Well, it is good to see you all on this Mother's Day, and we will be talking a little bit about what mothers bring into our lives this morning in a very positive way as part of this series, Under Pressure, which is a message series from 1 Thessalonians. And no, we are not going to change the title to Ice Ice Baby, although I will say, Rob, in our host MC role, I consider myself well roasted this morning, although I do want to point out one line of that song. Mr. MC says, quick to the point no fakin', cooking MC's like a pound of bacon, so look out. What goes around can come back around pretty quickly. So we are in this series called Under Pressure, looking at what it looked like, what it was for the Thessalonian Christians to live a life where they were truly under pressure, sometimes from within and also from without. We talked a little bit last week about those pressures. The culture around them was looking at these Thessalonian Christians and saying, wait a minute, you guys who are now saying Jesus is Lord instead of Caesar is Lord, this is not going to work. And so the authorities in Thessalonica were looking out for the Christians who were claiming Jesus is Lord. But also they were under attack from those who had been their brothers and sisters in the Jewish synagogue at times. They were under pressure from them as well. And so Paul writes this letter to the Thessalonican Christians after he has sent Timothy there to find out, how are you doing? How are you living? Said last week, the Thessalonian Christians have a lot to teach us about what faithfulness under pressure looks like. And we don't have to listen to the artist Bob Dylan from the 1963-64 song to know that times are changing. Things aren't what they once were, and we as Christians are finding ourselves at times under pressure from the culture around us. As we read the words of Scripture, to sometimes compromise those words of Scripture, to sometimes live differently than we believe God is calling us to live. I talked last week about the fact that the decade from 2000 to 2010 is often referred to as the wormhole decade. Because it's like we were standing at 2000, we were standing at this abyss and we dove through that and all of a sudden teleported ourselves to somewhere else. Things changed so quickly during these short 10 years with the advent of internet in everyone's house. And everybody being able to get their thoughts out so quickly. There was a study that came out from early 2000 that also talked about generational shifts, and I've shared this with you before. That generational shifts that used to take place every 20 to 30 years, by roughly around the year 2000, were happening every 7 years. That's how quickly things were changing. Generational shifts in thinking. And so as things have changed around us, there are times where we as a church, we as followers of Christ are finding ourselves under pressure. We talked last week about this as well. And as a people who find ourselves under pressure, we need to look to the Thessalonian Christians who knew that life and truth could only be found in God. We don't need to go other places to find truth about what life looks like and the way we need to live life and the kind of people we need to be. God has given us the direction and the truth that we need in that. So while facing great pressures from without and within, the Thessalonian Christians, they modeled faithfulness to the degree that they became an example to others. In church last week, I said we need to be those kind of people. And here is the guidance last week that Paul gave to those Christians in a town called Thessalonica nearly 2,000 years ago from 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. He said, in everything we do, in everything you do, Thessalonican Christians, in everything we do today as followers of Jesus today, as we find ourselves under pressure from the culture around us, we need to lead with faithful faith, with hope, and with love. That is the calling on our lives. if we want to be the kind of people we need to be, if we want to be the kind of people who can influence the culture around us without compromising who God has called us to be. Well, this morning we're going to move into chapter 2. We're going to see that once again the Apostle Paul is talking to a people who are under pressure. But instead of giving them advice for how to live, now he's going to do this kind of by proxy and by example, but he's going to remind them how he treated them, how he and his companions treated them, the Thessalonican Christians, seeing that they were going to be under pressure as they accepted the gospel message. And this goes back to the time that he spent with them in Acts chapter 17. So beginning in chapter 2, verse 1, here's what the Apostle Paul says. We're going to read this text through all the way once, and then we'll come back and make some comment on it at that point. He says, "You know, brothers and sisters, that our visit to you was not without results. We had previously suffered and been treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know. But with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition. For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We're not trying to please people, but God, who tests our hearts. You know, we never used flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. We were not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else, even though as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority. Instead, we were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. Surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preached the gospel of God to you. You are witnesses, and so is God, of how holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you who believed. For you know that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting, and urging you to live lives worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom and glory." Okay, beautiful section of Scripture. We're going to work back through this. And as we do, what we're going to see is the Apostle Paul is saying, here's how we treated you, Thessalonican Christians, knowing that you were going to be under pressure, knowing that times were going to be difficult. He begins by talking about the fact that when they came, he and his companions showed up in Thessalonica and they preached the gospel. Many people responded. The church was planted in those days. In that short, roughly a month he spent there before being run out of town. He says we were treated kind of rough, in Thessalonica. But that was actually on the heels of the outrageous treatment we received in Philippi. Now, at that point in time, Paul is saying, we could have decided if that's the way we're going to be treated when we preach the gospel, we're done preaching the gospel. We're not going to go from town to put ourselves out that way. No, we're going to go to places where people like us and receive us well. But that is not what Paul and Silas did. No, even though they had been treated poorly in Philippi, they go to Thessalonica and they decide we're going to preach the gospel again. And he says it was also now in the face of strong opposition. He goes on to say, listen, you remember when we were with you, our motives were pure in sharing the good news of Jesus with you. We weren't trying to be impure. We weren't trying to trick you. No, we are actually those who've been entrusted by God to preach the gospel. And in the end, we're not worried about what people think about us on either side. We just want to be faithful to God. He goes on to say, we didn't use flattery. We didn't butter you up so that you would then come and listen to our message. We didn't treat the gospel as a salesman treats a product. No, in fact, we weren't greedy in this at all. We didn't take anything from any of you, basically. Not even your praise. We didn't take money. We didn't take your praise. That's not what we were looking for. Although, as apostles of Christ, we had a right to assert our authority in God, he says. So this sets up what Paul is about to say next. As he says, here's the way we lived among you. And I want you to see these words. Here's what Paul says. Instead of all that we could have done, he says, instead, we were like young children among you. Now, Paul is for the next several verses going to use familial language as he talks about the way that he and Silas and others engaged with the Christians in Thessalonica. As they were about to face opposition, how did they treat them? He says, well, first, we became as meek as young children as we engaged with you. There's a humility in what Paul is describing. I want you to think about a young child looking up at his mother or father, or her mother or father, asking for something with humility, knowing I can't make this happen on my own. Mom or dad, I need you for this. That's what the Apostle Paul says first. He says, we became as meek as young children in the way we related to you. We humbled ourselves among you. Then he goes on to say this. He says, just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. I want you to hear these words in the language, the way that Paul is describing the love he had for these Christians. He knew were about to be under pressure as they decided to come out of the lives they were living, or they decided to say yes to Jesus, whether they were coming from the Jewish synagogue and saying yes to Jesus, or whether they were Greeks leaving behind their life where they said God or Caesar is king. As he addressed them, he says, this is the way we treated you. We became like children among you. And then just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. I want you to listen to these next words. He says, because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. We poured our lives into you. There are two kind of dominant theories that explain the behavior of people who find themselves under pressure. And you're probably familiar with the first, and you may not be as familiar with the second. So here are two dominant theories that talk about the way that people behave under pressure when they're facing stress, maybe corporate stress altogether, a lot of anxiety upon a population. How do people behave? The first theory is the theory of fight or flight, and you've probably heard of this one. When people are under pressure, when people are facing some sort of threat or stressor, they will respond by either fighting against the threat, the perceived threat, or running away from the threat. Now, social psychology tells us that this came out of thinking, a little bit older thinking, when we looked at we tried to measure the attitudes of men and didn't consider the attitudes of women often. So men are prone to fight or flight, although this is true about all of us as human beings. But as we started to measure some other attitudes, we found that there was a way that actually women tend to react under stress. They tend and befriend. And there's a big difference here. Now, this is what Psych Central says about this. The tend and befriend theory says that humans, particularly females, often respond to stress by tending to young ones and by seeking connection or befriending one another. When social interactions are comforting, stress levels decrease. So when there's a stressor, people will instinctively seek out support from others. Now, with that tend and befriend concept in mind, I want you to think about what the Apostle Paul says to the Thessalonican Christians. Here's how we treated you. He says, we cared for you as a nursing mother cares for her children. We saw a group of people that were about to be under stress, And maybe we could have come in and we could have decided we were going to fight those bad guys in the synagogue, or we were going to fight those guys down at City Hall. No, that's not what we did. We came in and we saw the pressure you were about to be under. And so what did we do? We cared for you as a nursing mother cares for her children. There was love and tenderness in the expression that the Apostle Paul and his companions had toward the Thessalonican Christians. He says as well, we shared our lives with you. And I want you to think again about this statement. Paul says, we shared the gospel with you. But we went to the point that we went beyond sharing the gospel to the point that we shared our lives with you. We gave of ourselves to you. In just a minute, Paul's going to describe exactly what that looks like and the shape and the form that took. But we gave of ourselves to you. We didn't hold anything back. We shared our lives with you as we shared the gospel, because that's what it means to be a messenger of the gospel. Is not only to speak the words of the gospel, but to live in love the calling of the gospel itself. And so Paul says we shared our very lives with you. We didn't just have a message for you. We had the love of Jesus for you as well. So the Apostle Paul and his companions, they knew the Thessalonian church was under pressure. So what did they do? They cared for them tenderly, choosing to share even their own lives. Here's what the Apostle Paul goes on to say. He says, surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. Surely you remember our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preached the gospel of God to you. You are witnesses, and so is God, of how holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you who believed. Now, when Paul says he loved the Thessalonian Christians, the word there is actually a Greek word that means deep affection. That they had deep affection for them. And so we should ask the question then, okay, if that's true, if you had deep affection, deep love for these Christians, how did you show these Christians who are about to find themselves under severe pressure for their faith, how did you show them that love? Well, he showed them this way. First, he suffered willingly on behalf of the Thessalonians. He came to them knowing that he would face opposition, that things would not be easy for him. But he had this good thing, this great thing, this message of God, and he knew he couldn't withhold that. And so as he came to Thessalonica, he was choosing to suffer willingly on their behalf. But on the flip side of that as well, he didn't want them to suffer on his behalf. He said, we resolved to not be a burden to any of you. So what we did was we worked both day and night. Maybe they were preaching by day and then working some sort of job by night. We know that the Apostle Paul was a tent maker at times, a leather worker. Paul says, whatever it took, we gave up sleep. We worked our fingers to the bone. We were willing to do whatever it took to suffer on your behalf to get you the gospel, but then we didn't want you to suffer on our behalf, so we took nothing from you, not even praise, not finances, nothing. We did not want to be a burden to you. And then the last thing that Paul says is this. He says, lived in such a way that no one could say anything against him. Holy, righteous, and blameless. Now, I think it's easy probably to gloss over this, but what the Apostle Paul is saying is people were going to say bad things against me. You ever been in that kind of place where someone that you look up to, someone else says something bad about, and it rocks you as much as if someone said something negatively about you? We're talking maybe character assassinations, right? Paul knew that plenty of people were going to say bad things about him. But he lived in such a way that even when people said negative things about him, the Thessalonian Christians would know the person he really, truly was. Now, the reality is, Paul has been talking about the way that many good mothers operate in this sense. Nursing mothers who care deeply about their children, who are willing to sacrifice anything and not wanting their children to have to sacrifice anything, and they live in a way that's above reproach. That's what he's been doing to this point. He's using mothers as an example. So thank you to many of you mothers for being those people. But Paul also turns now to talk about the way that fathers deal with their children in a general sense. And says, this way as well, we loved you deeply. He says, you know that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting, and urging you to live lives worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom and glory. And so it's not Father's Day, so we're not going to spend a ton of time here, but I do want you to see this. Paul says, we also showed our deep love for you in this way, as the best of fathers do. He encouraged and called the Thessalonian Christians to what he knew was best for them, even when it took challenge, especially in the moments where it took some encouraging. In all of this, Paul and his companions were showing these young Christians just what it meant to be a part of the family of God. And that's important. Remember, last week we talked about the fact that these folks were leaving behind family connections, many of them, as they came to say yes to Jesus. Many of them were having to walk away from their families to do that. And here Paul is saying, yes, you've walked away from one family who's rejecting you, but here is your new family. Here's this new place of acceptance where you will be loved deeply, where you will be called to what's best for you, because that is also deep love. As we'll say all throughout this series, the Thessalonian Christians have a lot to teach us about what faithfulness under pressure looks like. In the next few verses, we're not going to read these together, Paul actually commends the Thessalonian Christians for getting it, for understanding it and living it out. As he talks about the church in Jerusalem that was under pressure and the way they learned to live together as a family. He says they followed the example of the Jerusalem church, followed the example that he had set for them as well, and now they were living under pressure as the community and family of God as well in Thessalonica. And so here is our encouragement this week from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, living in the day and age that we are living. Let's go back. Here it is. As we find ourselves under pressure, we will need to remember again, church, just why the church is called to live as a family of God. As we face pressure, we're going to need deep love for each other that shows up in care and tenderness and nurturing and continues to call and encourage and challenge us to the best of what God has for us.